Curfew by Lucy M. Boston. While my two brothers and I were at preparatory school, our parents were living abroad, so that we had to spend our holidays with relatives. Our favourite uncle and aunt had bought a farmhouse on the outlying land of an old manor, of which the estate was being broken up. The big house, Abbey Manor, was being allowed to fall down in its own good time, the owner living in a smaller, dower house in the park. The cottage, which Uncle Tom and Aunt Katherine bought, had also been empty for a long time. Nettles grew up to the front door, and even between the flagstones in the larder. The cottage, however, had been well built, with stone mullions, leaded windows, and tiled floors. It had escaped the wanton smashing up that is the fate of most empty houses, perhaps because of its isolation. A profound silence brooded over it and the acres that went with it. My aunt had a passion for gardening, and there was much to be done before the weed-infested land should be disciplined to her intentions. But the wildness was a paradise for children. Walks in the adjacent park were among the excitements of our visits. There was the empty manor with its staring windows and lost melancholy garden, its weedy paths leading to locked gates. We had Sir Roger's permission to wander there, but never climbed the gate without a thrill or chill of expectation. One wing of the 15th century manor had, with sacrilegious defiance, been built over the former Abbey graveyard. Here and there in the grounds, lying open among the rhododendrons, were the empty stone coffins of forgotten abbots, left there perhaps as being too heavy to carry away, or out of boastfulness. They were grand things, hand-hewn from solid blocks of local stone, hollowed to the austerest outline of the human body, with a round resting place for the head. We passed them with great awe, and even with a kind of affection, as noble things treated with contempt, and now part of our private landscape. There was also a lake, reflecting the house and the stables, which were dusty, echoing, and forlorn. Uncle Tom, who liked everything shipshape, used to sigh over all this decay, but his wife had an eye open for everything that could be moved, bought, or made use of, such as a small wrought-iron gate, a sundial, or even, in an ambitious moment, as we all stood looking up at it, the little bell tower on the stables. Its 4 open arches and lead dome had the beauty of extreme simplicity against the pale green sky. "Why should it rot here?" she said. "It would suit our yard just as well." But the yard, surrounded by fine old barns, was Uncle's special domain, and he resented intrusion. "Rubbish," he said. "It's sure to be rotten. Besides, I hate pretentiousness." On our first visit to their farmhouse, Aunt Katherine had been busy making a wild garden out of an acre or 2 of heather and stone. It was boggy in places, and we helped to make watercourses for her, while she laid stepping stones and contrived tough slab bridges. There was a high mound in the middle of this patch, apparently artificial, though of some age, judging by the hawthorn tree that grew on it. And it was crowned by a large boulder. In the course of her construction, Aunt Katherine needed soil to raise her beds above the level of the surrounding damp, and, resourceful woman, looking at this hillock, decided to shift the top. With what delight we responded to her invitations to see if we could roll the boulder off, but our efforts were in vain. In the end, it took a team of all hands, with levers under the personal command of Uncle in his most arbitrary mood, to dislodge it. But at last the slope took possession of it, and away it rolled on a clumsy and fortuitous course, and came to rest at the edge of one of our little boggy streams. "Perfect," said Aunt Katherine, by way of thanks and dismissal. When next we came to stay, already her heather garden was taking shape. She had perfectly preserved the wild atmosphere, and the hillock was down almost to the level of the rest. "Look, boys," she said, "we struck on this yesterday." She showed us the top of a trough, or coffer stone, which her digging had half uncovered. The slab over it, that had served as a lid, had been prized up, and now rested sideways, leaving a gaping hole through which the loose earth on top had poured in. Aunt Katherine stopped with a gasp. "When did you open it?" she asked Uncle. "I haven't touched it, my dear." "Then who has been here? And why?" Was it a burglar? Was it treasure? We were all agog. Aunt Katherine laughed uneasily, and said she would guess that whatever was once in was now out, unless it was just old bones, and if so, she was not going to disturb them. "Old bones?" said Robert. "It's not the right shape for a coffin, not like the Abbott's. There's no place for the head. Perhaps it was a criminal who had been beheaded, or perhaps it was a case of double him up, like Punch's victims. Or perhaps an animal thing," suggested John hesitantly. He was young and imaginative. Robert had been rather gingerly shovelling off the clay that still clung to the lid. "There are words on it," he said. They all got busy with penknives, trowel and sticks to clean the letters. "Libra nos quaesimos Domine ab malo." Uncle Tom translated it for us. "Deliver us, O Lord, from the evil one." "I don't like it," said Aunt Katherine. Then she shrugged and became practical again. "I'm short of a slab for my stepping stones," she said. "This will do very well. Come on, boys, all together. Lift." The slab took its useful place face downward in one of the paths, and the coffin itself was skillfully planted with bushes of rosemary and Spanish gorse and trailing rock roses. By the time this story really begins, it had a natural and undisturbed appearance, and around the wild garden that it dominated, the lapwings and wagtails made themselves at home. It was the beginning of the long summer holidays. Aunt Katherine, having completed one plan, was now looking for something new, and the suggestion of moving the bell tower from the manor stables was raised again. We set off with Uncle Tom one afternoon to examine it. The manor stables surrounded 3 sides of a courtyard, and were in atrocious condition. The once beautiful and elaborate coach house let in the rain through a hole in the roof. The loose boxes were crumbling with dry rot. Our footsteps and voices rang intrusively as we did a tour of inspection before mounting the ladder to the lofts, and we explored such of these as had floors that would bear us. Spiders and rats were all that moved there now. Uncle Tom was the first to go up the second ladder, and thrust his body as far as his knees into the little cupola, while Robert and John were jostling on the lower rungs, their heads level with the opening. I was alone on a little square landing. On one side of me was the ladder. On 3 were doors opening into dark lofts, We had already explored them and knew them to be empty, and therefore I was very scared to hear a hoarse burst of laughter. Rather like a horse's cough that seemed to come from one of them. I tugged at my brothers and they came down, including Uncle, who had finished measuring and tapping. I told them there was something there, and we all went round again, and I'm afraid I took care neither to be first nor last in or out of any of the rooms. But we saw nothing, and I was mercilessly teased for my fear as we returned home. At supper that night, my aunt heard all about it. The measurements were very suitable. The condition not bad. "Though the bell's missing," said Uncle Tom. "You get a splendid view of our place from the roof, Katherine. I could see your bad man's coffin quite plainly. There's the chap who heard him too," he added, pointing his fork at me. "I'll go and see Sir Roger tomorrow. They say he'd sell the hat off his head if he could. I like the idea of having a bit of the old house here. Anything new looks new." "Don't you bring anything too old over from the manor," said Aunt Katherine. "Leave the ghosts behind, anyway." "Oh, it's too late to warn me about that," he retorted. "It was you who took the lid off the bad man's coffin. It was open already." "Well, who rolled the boulder away that was supposed to keep him down?" And again he pointed at us with his fork, and we grinned, though shudders ran down our spines. The next day, Sir Roger himself happened to pass our gate. He stopped to speak to us all, even Robert, John and me, grimy and barefoot as we were. "You are digging yourselves in very nicely here, I must say," he said to Uncle. "It all looks very jolly. I like the way you do it, too. Of course, I have no choice but to sell what I can, but these gimcrack buildings do gall me." This was a good opening, and before long bargaining for the bell tower had begun. It ended in Uncle's favour because at the last moment he brought out his trump card. There was no bell. "But there being no bell is one of its greatest attractions," said Sir Roger. "There's a legend, you know. It was called the Judas Bell, but where it originally came from and who betrayed what, I don't know. It was the old curfew. And of course, if people are out when they ought to be in, things are likely to happen to them. The old people round here say the bell had a familiar. The last person who rang it was my great-grandfather, who did it for a wager. And it is a fact that he was found dead. Rather horribly dead. After that, the bell was taken down and destroyed." "Well, you can't expect me to buy a legend about a bell that is missing," said Uncle Tom, and the bargain was settled at a very small figure. Before the end of the holidays, the graceful little bell tower was set up on the middle building in our stable yard. Both Uncle and Aunt were pleased. It was repainted to match its new position and looked well there. Wet weather had set in, and we had grown tired of all the games that can be played in the house. Then Robert said he would go and fish in the manor brook, and we followed with jam jars of worms. We had to cross the wild garden, which had, since Uncle's jokes, began to stir sinister feelings in us. The lapwings cried and veered and flung themselves along the wind. The thin rain pattered in the little brown streams, and the wagtails looked sharply at us, and ran hither and thither as though disguising their real activities. We began to run and shooed them away as if they were unwanted thoughts. But as we paused halfway across the stile into the park and looked back, There they all were as before, and the curlews sounded derisive, as if we had no business there. The little stream through the park had invaded the grass at its edge, beyond the cast of Thomas's fishing rod, and the lake into which it flowed had swollen into damaging proportions. The cinder road that led to the manor farm was under water, and the farmer was there with Sir Roger, bitterly complaining that it was all because the outlet sluice was blocked and had never been mended, and that the lake itself was silting up, and so full of weeds you couldn't tell where it began and where it ended. Sir Roger was listening with a pained expression. He promised to have it seen to as soon as the flood subsided enough to allow work to begin. As for us, we spent the afternoon happily testing the depth of every overflow, and returned home wet to the skin. A week later, dredging operations began on the lake. The sluice was opened, and the water sank to mud level. The weeds were cut down, and a band of old men in waders were wheeling the smelly, fibrous mud in barrows along the planks. We were there, of course, to watch. Much came to light that would never have been expected. A sunken boat, a scythe blade, a weather vane, a skull, and, most surprising of all, a bell. It was of unusual shape, but covered thickly with sharp flakes of rust. The pivot of its tongue was rusted up solid, so that it could not swing. "It's the old Judas Bell, like enough," said one old man. "Didn't I hear tell that your uncle had bought the bell tower? That's an odd thing for anyone to buy. I'd like to hear what my old woman would say if I came back one day and said I'd bought her a bell tower." We ran back to announce the find at home, and Uncle Tom called for Sir Roger and took him along to look at it. Uncle had a flair for antiques, and he thought that the bell might prove to be incised in some pattern which might be curious or of interest. But Sir Roger was interested in nothing but sherry and whippets, as we knew from Uncle's indiscreet conversation. "Look at the rust on it," he said. "I can't take any money for a thing like that. Certainly do what you like with it. I'm not superstitious, but I wouldn't touch it." Uncle shook his head at me and said we must expect the worst. The bell was sent to be cleaned and repaired, but even in its absence we now had a prickly feeling of foreboding. I remember the golden September weather, the scent of southern wood and lavender, and the yellow leaves spotted with black that were beginning to fall. But for us, the garden had become haunted. We no longer basked in it quite at our ease, or felt as heretofore that earth and fields, trees and sky were all our own. There were darker corners where we definitely did not go, where in a game of I Spy, for instance, nobody thought of hiding or looking. It was on the last morning of the holidays that the bell came back. It was delivered by van, wrapped in sacking, with its now mobile tongue thickly wedged and muffled in felt. We all hung around while Uncle unwrapped it. Seeing us so deeply interested, he made quite a ritual of it, marching off to the barn with us in procession behind him. The clapper he had kept muffled till the last. It was to be unveiled. When at last he pulled the first toll, the sound that it gave out was so unexpected as to be quite shocking. It was a high, wide-carrying note, and though it had a certain churchiness, there was in it something wild and almost scream-like. The afternote that vibrated long after within the bell sent a creeping chill up my spine. When the last sinister tingle had faded out of the shaken air, Aunt Katherine said, "I'm certainly not going to have that rung for dinner." it would take away my appetite. Uncle seemed not disposed to dispute it. He said, if they rang that at curfew, they gave you fair warning. We were to go back to school the next day, and this was a thought that blotted out all others. It was important to get the most out of the last afternoon. Towards sunset, when we were playing I Spy, I was crouching in a deep clump of red dogwood, not far from the house, holding my panting breath and listening for the approach of Robert and John. I heard their voices drawing off in the wrong direction, and was beginning to feel I had time to straighten my stiff knees before they could possibly return, and then to hope they wouldn't be too long, when with no other warning, a feeling of utter isolation and panic took me. I felt I was deserted, exposed to unknown dangers, perhaps trapped. I turned involuntarily to look behind me and saw two long-nailed, soily hands begin to part the leaves, and an evil face looked in. His hair and cheeks were clotted with earth, through which his yellow teeth showed more on one side than the other. His eye sockets were appallingly hollow, and he lifted his chin as the blind do when they seek. I shot out of the bushes like a rabbit when the ferret looks in, and ran as hard as my legs would carry me to the house. My clamour soon brought Robert and John and Aunt Katherine, to which I could give no better explanation than that I had seen a horrible face. She calmed me as best she could, saying it was probably a tramp coming in to pick up apples, and Uncle Tom should go round and send him off. Confidently, she and Uncle exchanged that word as if it met the case perfectly. Some tramps, a tramp, the tramp, as if a casual word like that could cover such lurking horror. Uncle Tom went striding off, looking very fierce, but he came back having seen nobody. Dusk had come. It was cold, and the wind was rising, and we, as may be imagined, had no heart to play outside. So, after tea, Aunt Katherine let us light the fire, and we persuaded her and Uncle to stay with us and tell us ghost stories. The others, I think, out of pure love of sensation, and I because it was the only way that I could get company for my thoughts and persuade the grown-ups to talk, however insincerely, on the same subject. The session opened, of course, with a little lecture from Aunt Katherine about the folly of the whole thing. Then the curtains were drawn, and Uncle Tom began. His personality and prestige added to the effect, for he was tall and bony, and we held him in awe. He told the old stories about midnight coaches, about grinning liftmen who had been seen in a dream the night before, about grey monks who had passed people on the stairs, and figures standing at midnight by one's bed, and they all to me had the same face. The wind rose rapidly in accompaniment to his tales, and our feelings of horror were already far outstripping the merits of his invention, when a really terrible thing happened. A gust of wind tore open the casement, and at the same time, the bell in the tower gave a jerky ring. Oh, there was no need to tell us any more stories. Our hearts were tight with presentiment. Its variable sound came and went with the gusts, even after the window was tightly closed again. It was not like a bell rung on purpose, but a bell evilly twitching on its own. "This is quite intolerable," said Aunt Katherine. "No one will sleep a wink tonight if that goes on." "Don't get in a fuss," said Uncle. "I'll go and take out the clapper. Nothing could be simpler. Now, boys, off to bed. Up we went, perforce, keeping close together, and clustered at our bedroom window to see him do this act of bravery. He seemed to waste hours talking to Aunt in the hall while we waited upstairs and listened to that vibrating shudder from the bell, the irregularity of which made it even more fraying to the nerves. The shadows under the yard walls were peopled for me with precise terror, and so was the room at my back. The keyhole howled too, and the wind in the chimney buffeted hollowly. At last we saw Uncle Tom come out into the light from the back door and go down the yard, where we could only by straining keep him in sight. Shadows swallowed him up, and we heard the barn door slam behind him. We fixed our eyes on the outline of the bell tower, and again it seemed an age before we thought we could distinguish his head, shoulders and arms waving against the sky. "There he is," said John in a whisper. Uncle had seized the bell, and the clanging stopped, but a moment later we heard him yell with the whole force of his great lungs, and his body disappeared down the manhole. The bell had stopped, but the wind still blew, and it was hard to tell where sounds came from. Robert thought he heard a dogfight going on somewhere. But Uncle Tom didn't come back. Time seemed too short now. We imagined how long it would be before he would appear, then doubled it, trebled it, and began again. At last, Aunt Katherine came out and shouted for him, ran halfway down the yard and shouted again. The maid came out too, and presently the yard was full of people with lamps and flashlights. They went into the barn after Aunt Katherine and came staggering out, carrying someone towards the house. We were seized with shame and undressed as quickly as we could, jumping into our beds. But Robert went on to the landing and called down the stairs to ask what had happened. "Go to bed, boys, and for the Lord's sake keep quiet and keep out of the way," said a woman neighbour. "Your uncle has had a nasty accident." And then we heard the horrible, mad, banshee sound of the maid having hysterics in the kitchen. Today's story was Curfew by Lucy M. Boston. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.